The rain had turned the trenches into something worse than hell, if hell could have a stench that clung to your skin and got into your lungs. I remember pulling my boots free from the muck, each step heavier than the last. My name's Henri Dubois, and I am a private member of the French army. I never wanted to fight a war, but when the shells started falling and the neighbors whispered about cowards, it didn't seem like much of a choice. That night, though, I wished I'd run for the hills instead. It was late, the kind of late where time doesn't mean anything anymore. Rain smacked the trench walls, and the air carried the tang of sulfur and rot. Sergeant Lefebvre came stomping down the line, his oilcloth flapping like a bird's wings. "Dubois," he barked. "You and Moreau scouting duty. Get your asses out there." I glanced at Corporal Moreau, René to me. He was barely 20, with a face too soft for war. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Out there? Now? In this?" Lefebvre snorted. "You're not going to melt, are you? Move before I kick you over the parapet myself." There wasn't much to argue. Orders were orders, and Lefebvre wasn't the kind of man you crossed. So, we climbed over, rifles slung, keeping low as we slipped into no man's land. The rain blurred everything, barbed wire twisted like dead vines, and the ground was pockmarked with craters deep enough to swallow a man whole. "Stay close," I whispered. René nodded, his teeth chattering loud enough to hear over the rain. We moved slowly, the kind of slow that makes your legs ache. Every step felt like a risk. Maybe you'd trip a wire or find the wrong end of a sniper's scope. But the night stayed quiet, except for the rain and the squelch of our boots. That's when we saw it, a jagged outline rising from the mud. A bunker, mostly buried, its concrete walls cracked and smeared with grime. "German," René whispered, like saying it too loud would wake something. "Looks abandoned," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. René's eyes darted around. "We should go back. Report it." I shook my head. "We're here to scout. Let's take a look." He hesitated, but he followed. The bunker's entrance was a black hole, the kind of dark that makes you question what's on the other side. I clicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting through the gloom. The air inside was damp and cold, and the smell hit me like a punch to the gut. Rotting meat and mildew, thick enough to taste. "Henri," René hissed. His voice had a quiver to it. "This place isn't right." "Stay close," I said again. The walls were carved up with scratches and deep gouges that formed jagged symbols. Some looked like writing, German words, I think, but others were shapes I couldn't place. They twisted and looped in ways that hurt my head if I stared too long. René muttered prayers under his breath, clutching the cross around his neck. That's when we saw it. In the corner, slumped like a forgotten puppet, was the mannequin. At first, I thought it was just some bizarre training dummy, left behind when the Germans retreated. It wore a tattered uniform, the gray wool soaked dark with who knows what. Its glass eyes caught the flashlight beam, reflecting like a cat's in the dark. But it wasn't just the eyes. It was the hands, thin, almost too thin, with fingers stained red at the tips. It looked wrong. It was too real, like someone had put a soul into it and left it to rot. "Henri, we need to go," René said. His voice cracked, panic bubbling up. I took a step closer, my flashlight steady on the mannequin. "It's just a dummy." René grabbed my arm. "Dummies don't bleed." I froze. He was right. The stains on its hands looked too much like dried blood. My stomach turned, and for a moment I thought I saw the mannequin's chest rise like it was breathing. I blinked, and it was still again. "Let's go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. René didn't need convincing. We backed out, our footsteps quick and clumsy. The rain hit my face like a slap when we got outside, and for the first time I was glad for it. We didn't say much on the way back to the trench. René kept glancing over his shoulder, his knuckles white on his rifle. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every shadow felt like it had eyes, and the memory of those glassy, lifelike orbs burned in my mind. When we reached the trench, Lefebvre didn't even look up from his cigarette. "Anything to report?" I hesitated. "Just an abandoned bunker." He grunted. "Good. Get some rest." Rest. As if sleep came easy in a place like this. I crawled into my dugout, wrapping myself in my damp blanket, but the cold wasn't what kept me awake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Those hands, those eyes, that faint rise and fall of its chest. When sleep finally came, it wasn't a relief. The dream was so vivid it felt real. I was back in the bunker, the air heavy and suffocating. The mannequin stood in the center of the room now, upright and looming. Its head turned toward me, jerky like a marionette on strings. The glass eyes locked onto mine, and I swear I saw them blink. Then it spoke. The voice was rough and broken, like it hadn't been used in years. "Help! Me!" It stretched out a hand, the fingers stained and trembling. "Please. Free. Me." I wanted to run, to wake up, but I was frozen. The mannequin stepped closer, its movements unnatural, the sound of creaking wood filling the air. Its face began to change, the smooth features warping into something almost human, but not quite right. "You must help before what?" It didn't say. The dream shattered like glass, and I woke gasping, my heart pounding like the guns on the front line. I lay there, staring into the dark, and I realized I wasn't just afraid of that mannequin. I was afraid of what it wanted, and why it had chosen me. The morning after that dream, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My body moved out of habit, my hands going through the motions of cleaning my rifle and checking my gear. But my mind was somewhere else, back in that bunker. René sat across from me in the trench, his eyes hollow, like he'd aged 10 years overnight. He didn't say anything, but he kept glancing at me like I'd brought something back with me. By midday, the shelling had started up again. It wasn't the worst barrage I'd seen, but it was enough to rattle the ground and send bits of dirt cascading into the trench. Lefebvre cursed as he passed, barking orders to keep heads down. For a while, the noise and chaos helped drown out the unease festering in my chest. But when the shelling stopped, that heavy silence returned, the kind that wraps around you like a noose. I couldn't stop thinking about the mannequin. Its words echoed in my head. Help me. Free me. What did it mean, and why had it felt so real? I told myself it was just a dream, but deep down I didn't believe that. Not entirely. René broke the silence. "Henri," he whispered, leaning closer. You saw it, didn't you?" I didn't want to answer, but the look in his eyes told me he already knew. "What are you talking about?" "The dummy," he said, his voice shaking. "It's not just a thing. There's something in it. Something wrong." I wanted to laugh it off, tell him he was imagining things, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded. "I don't know what it is," I admitted, "but it's not just a dummy." René's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "I've heard stories, Henri. My grandfather used to talk about places like that. Cursed places. He said they're like wounds in the world, where bad things crawl through." I didn't know what to say to that. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a fairy tale. But then I thought about the symbols on the walls, the way the air had felt in that bunker, thick and heavy like it was alive. Maybe René wasn't so far off. That night I dreamed again. This time I was back in no man's land, stumbling through the mud. The rain was pouring, but it didn't feel cold. It felt sticky, like it was clinging to my skin. I heard the voice before I saw it. "Henri." I turned, and there it was. The mannequin stood in the distance, barely visible through the rain. Its glass eyes shone in the dark, and its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The mud sucked at my feet, dragging me down. "Help me," it said again, louder this time. Its voice was clearer now, almost human but not quite. There was something off about it, like it was coming from somewhere deep and hollow. The mannequin stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "You must free me before it's too late." "Too late for what?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty landscape. It stopped, its head tilting to one side. "Before. It takes you too." I woke with a start, my heart hammering in my chest. The dugout was pitch black, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was awake or still dreaming. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the switch. The beam cut through the darkness, and I let out a shaky breath when I saw nothing but dirt walls and my gear piled in the corner. But then I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from outside. My blood turned to ice. It was slow and deliberate, like something was dragging its fingers along the trench walls. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the entrance, my breath shallow. The trench was empty, the moonlight casting long shadows over the duckboards, but the scratching continued, closer now. I swung the flashlight beam toward the sound, and for a split second I saw something. A figure, hunched and misshapen, darting out of view. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No answer, just the sound of my own breathing and the distant rumble of artillery. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless pacing and paranoia. When morning came, I felt like a ghost of myself, barely able to keep my eyes open. Renee noticed. "You saw it, didn't you?" he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Something, or someone. I don't know." He looked around, making sure no one else was listening. "Henri, you need to go back." I stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Back? Are you insane?" "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not going to leave you alone, not until you figure out what it wants." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was crazy. But deep down, I knew he was right. That mannequin, whatever it was, wasn't finished with me. And if I didn't go back to the bunker, it would find another way to haunt me. By midday, I made up my mind. I waited for a lull in the fighting, then slipped out of the trench. Renee saw me go but didn't try to stop me. I think he knew it wouldn't have mattered. The walk to the bunker felt longer this time, the landscape more twisted and alien. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the mud sucked at my boots with every step. When I reached the entrance, I hesitated. The darkness inside seemed deeper, almost alive, but I took a breath and stepped in. The bunker hadn't changed. The symbols still lined the walls, their edges sharp and fresh despite the dampness. And in the corner, the mannequin sat, just as I'd left it. But this time, its head was tilted upward, its glass eyes staring directly at me. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, a sickly green light that made my skin crawl. And then I heard it, a voice, not from the mannequin but from everywhere at once. "Free me," it said, "before it's too late." The voice seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating off the walls, wrapping around me like a cold wind. I couldn't pinpoint its source, but it had weight, a pressure that settled in my chest and made it hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered, and the faint green glow from the symbols on the walls grew stronger, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. "Free me," the voice repeated, deeper now, almost desperate. "Before it's too late." I didn't know what to do. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the flashlight. Who are you?" I managed to choke out. "What do you want from me?" The mannequin's head moved, ever so slightly. Its glass eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I could have sworn they weren't glass at all. They seemed alive, shimmering with something that felt ancient and terrible. The words, the voice said, softer now, almost pleading. The symbols. Read them. I turned my flashlight toward the walls, the jagged symbols glowing faintly under the beam. My stomach twisted as I tried to make sense of them. Some were German words I didn't understand, but others, the strange, looping shapes that hurt my eyes if I looked too long, felt older. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. I can't, I stammered. I don't know what they mean. The voice let out a low, mournful sound that echoed through the bunker. You must. They hold the key. I reached out, hesitating as my fingers hovered over one of the symbols. The air around it felt different, thicker, charged with some invisible energy. As I touched it, a shock ran through me, sharp and cold. Images flashed through my mind. Soldiers fighting and dying in a place that didn't look like this world. Shadows twisting into monstrous shapes. And that mannequin, always watching, always waiting. I stumbled back, gasping. What is this? The voice answered. The gate. It must not open. Before I could ask what it meant, the symbols on the walls flared brighter, illuminating the bunker with an eerie green light. The mannequin began to move, its limbs jerking as if controlled by invisible strings. It rose to its feet, towering over me. Its face, no longer smooth and featureless, was now warped, shifting between human features and something far worse. Henri. The shout jolted me out of my trance. René was at the entrance of the bunker, his rifle raised. Get out of there! I turned to run, but the mannequin, or whatever it was, lunged toward me, its movements impossibly fast. René fired, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the mannequin, but it didn't slow down. It kept coming, its glass eyes blazing with that unnatural light. I scrambled out of the bunker, René pulling me to my feet. What the hell is that thing? He yelled, his face pale with fear. I don't know, I shouted back, but we can't let it leave. The bunker shook, a low rumble growing louder beneath our feet. The symbols on the walls began to fade, their light dimming as the mannequin emerged from the entrance. Its body twisted and elongated, its limbs bending in ways that defied reason. René grabbed my arm. Run, Henri! We bolted, slipping and stumbling through the mud. Behind us, the bunker collapsed in on itself with a thunderous roar, a cloud of dust and debris billowing into the air. But the mannequin, the thing that had been inside, wasn't gone. I could feel it, a presence pressing against my mind, watching us even as we fled. We didn't stop until we reached the trench. Lefebvre was waiting, his face a mask of irritation. What the hell happened out there? He barked. René tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the terror still gripping me. The bunker collapsed, I said. It's gone. Lefebvre frowned but didn't press the issue. Fine. Get some rest. Rest. As if that was even possible. René and I sat in silence, the weight of what we'd seen hanging heavy between us. Finally, he spoke. Henri, what if it's not over? I didn't have an answer. Deep down, I knew he was right. Whatever we'd unleashed in that bunker wasn't finished with us. Not yet. That night, the dreams returned. They were worse this time. I saw the mannequin again, but it wasn't alone. Shadows moved around it, shapes that were both human and not. They whispered in a language I couldn't understand, their voices like the rustling of dead leaves. The gate, the mannequin said, its voice filling my head. It must not open. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. René was already awake, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. It's here, he whispered. What? I asked, my voice hoarse. I can feel it, watching us, waiting. A chill ran down my spine. The air in the trench felt wrong, heavy and oppressive, and then I heard it. the faint sound of scratching coming from the far end of the line. Renee and I exchanged a glance before moving toward the sound, our rifles at the ready. What we found made my blood run cold. Symbols, like the ones in the bunker, were carved into the trench walls, their lines fresh and glistening. The scratching continued, louder now, coming from just beyond the next bend. "Stay close," I whispered. Renee nodded, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. We turned the corner and froze. The mannequin stood there, its glass eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, but it wasn't alone. Shadows swirled around it, their shapes shifting and flickering like smoke. They whispered, their voices filling the air with a sound that made my ears ache. "Henri," the mannequin said, its voice cold and hollow. "You must choose." "Choose what?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Close the gate, or let it consume everything." Before I could respond, the shadows surged forward, their shapes twisting into monstrous forms. Renee fired, the shots echoing in the narrow trench, but it didn't stop them. They closed in, their whispers turning into a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly, they were gone. The mannequin stood alone, its glass eyes dimming. "The choice is yours," it said, before collapsing into a heap of lifeless wood and cloth. Renee and I stared at each other, the silence around us more terrifying than any sound. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished with us, and the gate, whatever it was, wasn't going to stay closed for long. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more stories like this.